Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk with Kristina Podnar. She is a digital policy consultant and she is a principal at NativeTrust Consulting, which is a digital governance advisory firm. And she's got 20 years of experience in management consulting experience. And I'm just really excited to have her here. We've been having this wonderful conversation that goes well beyond digital expertise, but we're going to have a wonderful conversation here, and she's going to talk about some things that are really, really important, especially as businesses are transforming, digital marketers are transforming. There's a lot of shifts happening within the industry, and she's going to be able to explain it a whole lot better than I will. so I'll let her do it. But Kristina, welcome. We're excited to have you here in the Leaders Transformation.
Thanks for having me. I know we've been planning this for a long time, and it's such a great honor to be here and finally do this.
Yes, it's a pleasure. And thank you to Ashwin Krishnan, because he's the one who introduced us a year ago. And we were going to do this interview almost a year ago now, and just life happened, and so it didn't work out. But here we are. It's the perfect time, and I'm really excited to have you here, Kristina. Also, I'm excited to have the listeners, if you're watching on video, I'm excited to have you here because you're the reason why we do this podcast. I love hanging out with wonderful people who are making, amazing differences in the world, but I also love sharing it so that it can inspire you to be the difference maker and the world changer that you're capable of being. And maybe you're in IT and maybe you're saying, I don't know, transformation all sounds very woo-woo. Like, how can I, create transformation in the world? How can I be a difference maker or a world changer? And the reality is, I believe that every single person has a strength, has some tremendous value to bring to the world, in a way that you do it that is different than the way other people do it or other people see it. And so you can bring that value to the world and create shifts. Maybe they're little shifts in industries. Maybe they're huge, shifts on a global scale or industry-wide scale. Doesn't really matter as long as we're all contributing to that improvement and so forth. So we'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com. You can find me there. Send us a message through the contact page. You can find us on social media and leave us a message there. But we'd love to hear your story and how you're creating transformation, or how you are planning to do it, and how we can support you in doing that. All right. So Kristina, let's talk about you're a digital governance advisor. What is that? Why is that so important right now?
Well, it's interesting because people always sort of look at me funny and say, hey, you focus on digital policy. Is that some government thing, or what are you doing over there? But, the way that I really describe this is, we all came from what I call the wild, wild west days, if you will, of the internet, right? Back when we did crazy things like stand up websites without really worrying, are they going to be up or not? We did things like pass credit card information to banks that was unencrypted. And, that was fine for circa 1995, 96, 97 when we started. But here we are in 2019, the world is a different place today. And what's interesting is we haven't really grown up and moved beyond where we were maybe 10 or 15 years ago in our maturity, in how we do things like handle personal data, in terms of how we think about websites, mobile applications, and making sure that they're accessible to everybody, you and me, and perhaps those who are colorblind and those who don't have any vision at all, or perhaps are lacking their hearing. We need to make sure that we are compliant with these legal and regulatory requirements that are new around the world. And so, what digital really has done is disrupted the world as we know it. And disrupted is such an overused word, but it really is the right word, because it's really just changed everything for us over the last 20 years. And for a lot of digital marketers and organizations out there, we just haven't kept up the way that we have in other areas. And so that's what I do. I am actually somebody who advises organizations on how to balance out the risks and the opportunities that digital brings to the organization and to marketing.
Got it. All right. So Facebook keeps getting, in trouble on this, this issue. Why is a company that is that large, why do they not have this sorted out yet?
Well, so that's sort of an interesting perspective. A lot of people say, hey, Facebook and Google, they don't have it sorted out. I'm on the fence of whether they have it sorted out or not. And here's why. We don't necessarily agree with what they're doing as individuals, but we have to remember that they're a business, right? They do have a business model and they are making money. And so arguably, if that's really their entire objective, right? And if we take a look at what their mission is and their goals are, if their goal is simply to grow and to make money and to bring Facebook to the world, which is what we've heard Mark Zuckerberg publicly state, then they are actually achieving their goals and they've actually aligned themselves well in terms of digital policy. Perhaps not the way that I or you would define it, right? But the way that they've defined it for themselves. And so every time, and historically when we look at it, the way that Facebook has positioned themselves, it's not as the company that's doing great things with, protecting privacy and enabling users to collaborate and communicate while protecting data, right? Those aren't the things that we've heard from them historically. What we have heard is they want to connect everyone around the globe. As many people need to be on their platform as possible, and they've achieved that. And so they are continually running into problems because the paradigm that they have for business is working for them, but they're functioning in this really outdated legal and regulatory framework. And that's because we're behind, right? Just
Right.
like as individuals we're behind, so are the governments and the regulators. And we haven't gotten ahead of digital. And so we're kind of getting to the point where we're butting heads now and running into these issues and coming to a point where we need to have a conversation, not just as Facebook and regulators, but Facebook, regulators, NGOs, nonprofits, private citizens, and other organizations, because this is a much bigger issue. And it really starts to kind of question, what do we as a society want? And what sort of values do we hold dear as a society that may or may not translate into the digital sphere if we continue to just go at this pace?
Got it. Yeah, and so what I hear in there is priority. So maybe it's not a priority for them. There were other priorities that, like you said, that's very true. They've achieved their goal,
Mhm.
right? And it just might not have been our goal or what many people would consider their goal. Now, the challenge with this whole idea of protecting information and not giving out information, it's interesting. When my mother was admitted to the hospital and she was 3,000 miles away. And I found out that she had been rushed to the hospital. So it took me forever to find which hospital she was at. But then when I called and I spoke to them, they would not give me any information over the phone because who am I? I said, I don't give, what do you want? Like, what kind of validating information do you need? They said, well, you need to come in. I'm like, well, that's a little hard to do, right?
Yeah.
My brother ended up driving down, which he was doing anyway, but he was about 2 hours away. So we didn't get information right away because of this very reason. So it's protecting in one area, which is great. And then other areas like this, it's like, I really want to know what's going on. And so there's a balance there. Like, how do you differentiate from that? And as a company, how do you determine where that line is? Actually, the only reason why I found out which hospital she was at was because I got on the phone with EMS. And I had called all these hospitals and they're all like, no, she's not here. She's not here. And then finally somebody said, why don't you try the EMS? So I called them. I spoke to somebody and he says, I don't know. I can't tell you anything. And then she says, one moment, let me give you to my supervisor. I get the supervisor on the phone. I explain the situation and he tells me, yes, she has been picked up and she was taken to this hospital. I'm not supposed to tell you that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to tell you because obviously you're in a dilemma right now. It's like, if you don't tell me where she is, how do we find her, right? And it turned out she was in a hospital in Toronto, which I wouldn't have guessed, but it was because it was based on the issue that she had cardiac arrest, that they took her to a specific hospital, which I wouldn't have thought about.
Right.
Yeah, talk about this whole dilemma which companies, organizations have.
And so, that's actually the perfect example. I wouldn't have given it if you had asked me for one, but it's a perfect example to illustrate, a sort of a broken area, if you will, that hasn't caught up with not just digital, but really how information is managed and treated. And so if we stop and think about this for a moment, if anybody's if anybody has had an issue of, having their information recently breached, I think we all have by now, right? You can actually go to Experian, you can go to Equifax, and you can freeze your credit. And when you go online to do that, they ask you, what is your name? What are the last 4 of your social security number? So they don't want to know the whole thing. And then they actually ask you things like, hey, which phone number are you associated with? Which street have you lived on? And they'll ask you one more question. They go, oh, that's it. You're done. Credit frozen. Congratulations. Hospitals could do something very similar. When you called up and said, hey, I'm trying to figure out which hospital my mom is at. Is she at your hospital? They could have said, well, what's her name? Okay, you say her daughter, great. Can you please verify for me her address, her date of birth? How many children does she have? Things that are actually publicly available, but usually only known to an inner circle. And it would have been enough to validate that, yes, you're not some completely random stranger. You're not somebody who's looking to scam her. You are, in fact, a family member or, a daughter. And with that information, we'd be happy to share with you what we can. But unfortunately, you see the hospitals, the doctors are sort of living in this old paradigm, in this world where they don't really even think about that. And so you're at the mercy of that one individual who says, I realize your distress. I understand that you're in this really pickle or a jam of a situation. Let me help you out because I feel for you. But we have that every day. We have it with hospitals and doctors. We have it with banks, right? When I call up a bank, it's the same thing, right? It sort of kills me that Bank of America, this huge bank that I can send international wires through, can't verify quickly who I am on the phone to answer my question. And a lot of times they'll say things like, well, you either need to come in or can you fax us a note? And I'm like, fax, I haven't seen that. And I don't have that. I don't have that machine. I haven't had one for, 10 years. And so organizations just really are not at that point yet where they've adjusted a lot of their processes to the realities of today. And in my mind, yes, it's digital. I think it goes beyond that into what we call omnichannel, which is you as an individual should be able to interact with me as a business however you want to. Whether it's walking into that hospital because your brother is nearby and he can do that, whether it's phoning in because you're 3,000 miles away and you can't, whether it's you want to be able to send them an email or perhaps text them, or maybe just log in to a central database system where you can say, I'm self-identifying, I have a relative who's in a hospital, I don't know where, but I need to find out, because guess what? That's a very legit use case. And a lot of people out there would say that's a fairly common one, especially in the United States or North America, where, we move further away from our families and it is normal to sort of be, geographically dispersed. And that would actually happen as people start to age and baby boomers come about.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. But, and it's interesting because we see that continually, right? Whether it's Facebook data, where we see hospitals, what we don't see is that organizations are adapting themselves for the realities of today.
So where do they start to do that? And how do you help them to do that?
Well, so it's interesting. One of the things that I did is, after 20 years of doing consulting, I looked at and said, you know what, I can't be the only person who's having to kind of talk about these things. Other people inside of their organizations need to be catalysts for what they're doing from a digital perspective. And so I wrote this book, The Power of Digital Policy, and I talk about the things that every organization needs to think about. And it differs, right? Whether you are, and it's funny because people kind of go, oh, it differs probably based on my size. No, it differs in terms of where you are as a business and how mature you are from a policy perspective. If you're just starting out on a digital transformation process, perhaps you haven't been dabbling at all. You had a website for years, but haven't done much with social or mobile or, any of these new digital channels that we're using. Then you're at a specific place and time, if you will, that's really kind of early on in this maturity curve that I described. You're almost a starter in the digital policy realm. And I described to you the 5 or 6 things you really need to think about. What does that look like? What are the questions you ought to be asking yourself? Things like, let's say it's website accessibility, right? Because we want to be able to make a website very accessible to whoever's using it. And it doesn't just have to be somebody who's perhaps deaf or blind. It could be somebody who's simply older and has carpal tunnel and a hard time using their mouse, right? So we want to design a website that's sort of more accessible to a broader audience. So how do you do that? What are the questions you ask? What are the legal ramifications for having to do that? What are the things that you're trying to actually do as a business? Right? A lot of people say, well, I know that there's this thing called Americans with Disabilities Act, but I don't have to comply with that. And I was go, okay, fine, don't comply with that. If you don't think you have to, that's your interpretation. As long as you're willingly and deliberately taking that risk on, I'm comfortable with that. But the question is, what is also the opportunity out there, right? If you look at it, 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, right? That's a really large number to be ignoring in terms of profitability potentially. And so do you really want to not cater to that audience? And so, different things to think about. And it's true for data management. It's true for, things like branding and reputation. It's true for social media and how you're going to speak in social media. Are you going to allow individuals that work for your organization to use social media to speak about you as an organization publicly? And so it sort of just permeates everything. But you have to kind of have the starting point, which is, are you a business that's just starting out on this journey? Are you sort of more advanced and looking to get beyond plugging the holes and being reactive into more of a proactive stance? Or are you sort of trying to be one of those expert companies that's establishing the gold standard? Because we do have those as well. Companies that feel like they've been doing digital transformation for years now, and for them, they really want to be the standard in the industry. So that's usually a good starting point. And self-assessing. One of the people that I've become friends with lately said to me, in order to understand where you want to go, you kind of have to work backwards, understand where you are today, and kind of map that, right?
Yes.
It's the same thing with businesses. You got to figure out where you are in order to go to where you want to get to.
Yes, my cat just woke up. He's been sleeping for like 6 hours, and he just decided he wants to be part of this conversation.
He heard digital transformation and digital policies.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Chess.
Hi, Chess.
There.
All right. Hi, buddy.
Camera. Yeah, he's like, whatever. All right. Those of you that are not watching, you're like, what's that about? Anyway, I have a very social cat who's the invisible mascot of the Leaders of Transformation.
Oh, I love that.
Well, it's interesting you talk about this because, it's a big issue, and people are on various levels of, I guess, expertise with it. You mentioned something, just kind of sort of alluding to it, about the, and I remember reading this in your material, talking about the, when you're putting something out there, even on social media. So we can think about it in terms of personal, protection of personal information. But when we're talking about also, even just when you're putting information content, so the consistency of content out there on the web, do you deal with that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so when we kind of think about consistency of content, especially let's take it from kind of a business perspective, right? When we're kind of thinking about who we are as a business organization, and especially if you're in charge of marketing for your organization, you have some priorities probably. Things like furthering your brand, protecting your reputation, promoting your products or your services. And so the information that you're going to be putting out there has to have integrity. And that might be something that is very formalized in terms of a campaign. It could be something that's ad hoc like social media, or it could be potentially the fact that you're trying to rally your employees to kind of boost your visibility out there. And you're saying, hey, feel free to go out there and represent our brand. But all of that comes at a risk, right? So, and there are different risks. If we stop and think about it, people kind of go, oh yeah, you're right. We could put out information that's just wrong. Okay, that's an obvious risk. But the sort of other side of the coin there is you could be putting out information that's outdated before it's actually been published. And I see this a lot in healthcare, especially. Healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, folks in the medical field are very leery of saying the wrong thing, right? FDA might fine us, or it might say something that gets us sued. So it's best just to, go through all these levels of approval before we actually get the information pushed out there. And that might seem good and safe, and it is. But the problem is that you're stifling creativity and freedom and innovation. Right. And if you're trying to push out a message really quickly, let's say, during the measles outbreak, right? You don't want to wait to get that information out there. You want to get there, first, especially if you have a vaccine in the marketplace that can prevent measles. Let's get that out there right away. And so, the converse side of that is, can we actually free up the content ecosystem inside of an organization so that employees are free to get information out quickly, but get information out there that is also protective of the organization and on par with the brand and the reputation that you have to protect. So, there are different ways of looking at that. And what I do really is help organizations create those guardrails. That's really what digital policies are. They are the guardrails that allow people to understand the safe zone in which they can operate before they start putting themselves or the company in danger. And it's great because, if we can define that space as being safe here, then I can do a lot of different stuff and maneuver around and not get into trouble. Conversely, I know when I'm getting to the edge that I might need to slow down and go ask for permission or perhaps do some additional coordination because I'm getting close to kind of breaking sort of my guardrails and going over a cliff, and I don't want to do that. So I think that's really, really important to define, and I think that for most organizations, they're lacking that today, which is kind of ironic if you think about it, because we still live in an era where if you're going to be out of work for more than 3 days, you have to bring a doctor's note. So we have a policy like that, but we don't have policies that say, hey, how do we get good content out there that has integrity, adds value, converts prospects to customers, and gets the job of business done. And that's really what those digital policies are all about.
So now you come in and you help them with larger organizations, and for smaller organizations, they can read your book, as you were saying, which is great. We'll make sure there's a link in the show notes to that book. How do they find out about you, or at what point do you find a lot of the time they come to you because they've had a breach and then they need to fix it? Or are a lot of the companies now trying to be proactive with it? What do you find is happening?
There's a mix. So, the great news is, the great news in giving a little gold star to everybody who's really doing a great job out there trying, is that 70% of the time I get folks who are being proactive. And they're saying things like, hey, I'm going to actually try and expand my market, and I'm going maybe into South America and I haven't been there before. I don't want to make a mistake as I do that. Can you help me out? I want to be on the right side of the law. I don't want to break any regulations. And I also don't want to offend culturally people. How do I get that done and done it, do it right? So we have those types of scenarios, or people just looking to be more of that gold standard. But we also get the folks, that say, hey, I just got a letter in the mail that's threatening to sue me because my website isn't accessible. Or, gosh, we had a data breach and I thought we did a great job, but turns out that, we were working with this third-party vendor and I wasn't even thinking about them. And that's really where the breach happened, right? And so it's not always within just your organization. It's your partners, it's your vendors, it's the other people that you're working with that you might not be thinking about every day. So there's a whole ecosystem there. And again, I bring it all back to risks and opportunities, right? Because it's all about that. And that's really, at the end of the day, that's the bottom line for the business, right? It's not about digital. It's not about IT. It's not about marketing. It's about the business saying, we are using digital in a way that is helping us achieve business objectives. And we're taking on the risk that we feel comfortable taking on, both fiscally, reputationally, et cetera. And that's where I like to see organizations having the conversation. And you're right, whether they're large or they're small, it's still a conversation to be had. In fact, right now I'm working with a really small company that has 5 employees in the US. And they are actually trying to become GDPR compliant, which, if your listeners don't know about GDPR, it's the European Union's data privacy regulation that came into effect last year. And this company basically said, we want to be GDPR compliant, but we want to be GDPR compliant for everybody, wherever they are in the world, and for our employees in the US, which is insane, right? It's a really tall order to fulfill. And when I asked their CEO, I said, why? What's the driver? Why are you trying to do this? I want to understand so I can help support you. And he said, why not? He said, it's the right thing to do. And so,
wow.
Right?
I was thinking maybe it was because of their vision that they wanted to go into these these countries, and they wanted to make sure they were already covered. But yeah, that's interesting.
No, it's an ethical thing, and it aligns directly back to their business objectives and their principles of who they are and doing the right thing.
Yeah. This has been great. And so I was circling back. There was something that I was thinking what I wanted to share with you. There's a gentleman, Rich Donovan, that I interviewed in the beginning of the year, or came out in the beginning of the year, who has a company called Return on Disability Group. And really interesting. I should connect the two of you. He, what they do is, you talked about 1 in 4 Americans, North Americans, self-identify as having a disability. He actually goes into major companies and says, look, if this is, if I could show you how to bring value and have a new product that for a market that is currently 25% at least, but even if you talk about family and friends and all this, you're talking about over 50%, that you could introduce a new product that would serve that market, which is currently underserved would you be interested? And of course they're like, well, yeah. And so that's what he helps them do. But I think the complement between what you do and what he does could work really well. So there's so much that you must be able to do to be able, in the way that you look at this, for you to be able to do what you do. How did you learn all this? And how did you get into this? I mean, I'm sure as a little girl you weren't thinking digital governance. That's going to be the thing.
No. In fact, you know what? I grew up in the days of Unix and Pine, if you remember those days, right? So much sort of,
enough.
yeah, I know we both are. So yeah, those were those days before digital was a thing. I accidentally ended up in the digital space. It was a pure accident, but it was in those wild, wild West days. And what I started to see is that my clients, every so often, I worked for an agency that would design websites, and every 3 to 4 years, clients would come back and say, hey, can you redesign our website? Because it got really messy, it got really bad, and they were just doing crazy things. And there was a pattern. And I thought, you know what, if we could just solve that problem, you wouldn't have to pay me every 3 to 4 years. And the agency I was working for said, that's not the best sort of business model because you're costing us money. We don't want to solve the problem. We want to keep making these websites. But I decided to really get into digital governance because I realized that this is a problem that needs to be solved. And, you know, over the years, what I've seen is that there's a lot of really great, competent people out there that can help contribute to solving that problem. And that's sort of where I guess, you know, everything that I've picked along the way up at this point is what I'm looking to share with others, because I want all of us as a community to be enabled and to actually do this. But yes, no grand plan in terms of getting to this point. What I would say is just lots of experience and diverse roles in digital. And if anybody's looking to do much the same, as long as you kind of have a mind for rules and you like understanding the gamut of digital, meaning like, you know, you can look at a brand and a logo as well as a server and understand that it has to be secured, then, you know, you can get into this line of work. Oh, I think your friend's back. Oh, and I can't hear you. Something happened with your speakers or your audio.
Yeah,
oh, there you are.
One sec. Yeah, he just jumped off my lap, so edit that out.
No worries.
I'm like, okay, I thought, yeah, I'll get him off my lap rather than him wiggling around.
And he was like, that's what you think.
All right, then.
There you go. I love it.
Yeah.
It's life.
Well, there's so much to what you're doing, and I can just imagine, because I like organizing and sorting, and you mentioned about somebody who likes rules. I can imagine it's also somebody who likes to keep things organized and simplified. I like things being a certain way. So even in my website, I had a breach on my website.
Oh, that's
and you know, and I go in the back, and I had somebody that was helping me with it, but and doing the actual work. But I logged in. I'm like, okay, what is going on? So I look, how is this possible? Because it happened multiple times, and I had somebody, you know, assisting me with it to clean it up and apparently block all the gates and whatever, you know, so that he can't get in. How is this possible again? So I look back there, and it's like so messy. And there's in my hosting, on the hosting site, and then I'm looking, and I'm like, why do I have, I mean, this website's long gone, and this one doesn't exist, this domain doesn't exist, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, why is this still here? But I like things clean and neat and organized and all of that. And so my mind, as you were talking, was imagining all of the different moving parts and how you got to be able to put all these things together and make it work. It's amazing. I'm glad you're doing it, because yeah, I don't know that I'd have the patience to do it in the digital space per se, and to actually get it done. It's one thing to see it, but it's another thing to actually make sure and implement the strategies and the systems that need to be in place. That's the big, you know, that's the bridging the gap between what we know we should do and
getting it done
and actually doing it. Yeah. So our listeners can go and get your book, Power of Digital Policy. They can go to Podnar, I say Podnar, so that's with an A, .com. And we'll make sure this is all in the show notes. But I just really appreciate you being here and sharing a little bit of it. Maybe even if it is creating awareness in an area where people kind of knew that they would need to eventually deal with. But, you know, the reality is it's something that needs to be dealt with early on,
Mm-hmm.
not just when you're a big organization or Facebook or Google, but these are things, or when, new policies come in for how you handle your email marketing and all that kind of stuff. But it's something that there's so much more to it. And so I appreciate you bringing some awareness to that. And I'm sure we all could use a little bit of digital governance tweaking, shall we say. So.
Well, let me say too that if you don't want to go out and get the book, I know that I'm not supposed to say that. My publicist would probably kill me, but I do have a quiz that you can actually take on my website, which will actually tell you where you are in this digital policy journey. And I do have examples of the type of policies you ought to be thinking about. And that's actually all in a resource center that's freely available to your listeners. So if they do head over to the website, they can just take advantage of that.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll make sure that's also listed there so that people know to look for that. That is fantastic. So K Podnar, that's KPODNAR.com. You can check that out. Great, great resources. Thank you so much for being here, Kristina. I appreciate you and your patience, and even just doing this interview a year after we talked about doing it. But you know what? Everything comes in perfect timing. So I just so appreciate you. And I appreciate our listeners for tuning in. And I hope you got something out of this. I hope, if anything, it just created some awareness. Now, I do believe leaders of transformation take action. So check out Kristina's website. Go and do that quiz so that you can kind of see where you're at and then start to create a plan towards where you want to be. And, don't ignore this. Don't wait till you have the breach. Don't wait till you have the letter, the call to be, doing something about it. Be proactive about it, and you can save yourself a lot of heartache on the back end. So again, thank you so much for being here, Kristina. We appreciate you. And we look forward to seeing you all in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.
Thanks for having me, Nicole. Take care.